This is the third talk in a 4-week series. Why, Lord? Wrestling with the mystery of suffering. I've said in our earlier studies that we'll be attempting over a few weeks to answer this challenge of human suffering. We will attempt to build up the big picture, which is a little bit like putting the individual pieces of a jigsaw together. The more pieces of a jigsaw that you have, the clearer the picture. But we haven't got all the jigsaw pieces. And neither do we have the picture on the box lid. But we have some. There are no perfect answers to the problem of suffering. And as I've said in the last study, we discovered that even the Apostle Paul, who has 13 of the 27 books of the New Testament attributed to him, admits that his knowledge is only partial and incomplete. But one day, when Christ returns, he and we will know all things. So there will always be an element of mystery when we are speaking about suffering. And 4 short talks on this subject will not comprehensively explain why there is so much suffering in the world. But quick recap. In my first talk, I highlighted the different approaches to the question of suffering. The philosophical approach, which largely focuses on the existence of evil in the world. Where did that come from in a world created by a God who is good? Then there is the theological approach, learning about the great themes of love and justice of God, that God is all-knowing, all-loving, and all-powerful. The biblical approach, where the focus is on certain biblical texts and passages and seeking to understand what they are telling us. There's the pastoral approach, which focuses on making sense of the pain and suffering that we face personally. Economic approach, which focuses on how to resolve suffering caused through extreme poverty. And I'll be dipping in and out of all 5 areas. Over the last couple of weeks, I've spoken about the jigsaw piece of human freedom, in that most of the suffering in the world is caused by human beings who have made wrong choices. Free will is a gift that God has given all people, a gift that we have all abused. God chose not to make us robots that were programmed always to love him and do as he desired, but to give us freedom of choosing for ourselves whether to love him and do good rather than evil. Last week, we noted that Jesus simply refused to be drawn into this discussion on the cause of suffering, but was more concerned about the way that the people responded to what had happened. Incidentally, all of the talks are on our YouTube channel, Tamworth Elim Church Online. Most of the world's suffering is caused through humans' free will, man's inhumanity to man. For example, this week we learned of that shooting in an Austrian school killing 10 students, which was down to the free will choices of a deranged human being. It was heartbreaking. Understanding suffering caused by other humans in some respects is much easier to understand than the suffering caused by natural disasters, earthquakes, tornadoes, tsunamis, crop failures causing hunger and death. Why doesn't God step in and prevent them? Surely God could do that if he so wished. He wouldn't be standing on anyone's toes in terms of freedom of choice. And this is a really hard question and one that has no simple answer, but let's give it a try this morning. Firstly, we need to recognize that even in natural disasters, there is often a human element. Following the Mexican earthquake in October 1985, the Times newspaper wrote that among the reasons for the disaster were second-rate workmanship, skimping on construction materials. There is a wide agreement that many buildings need not have fallen and that many lives could have been saved had some builders been more scrupulous. Probably the strongest lesson from the Mexico City disaster is that good architecture works, writes the Times. In recent times, I've discovered a whole field of engineering called earthquake engineering, which is concerned with structuring buildings to withstand earthquake, which begs the question, why are some places missing out on this technology? Places like Kathmandu in Nepal, where nearly 9,000 people lost their lives and 22,000 people were injured in a destructive earthquake some 10 years ago in April 2015. I read an article regarding this disaster, which was entitled, and the title just really did grab my attention, "Earthquakes don't kill people, buildings do." The article states by saying that the earthquakes may have caught Nepal off guard, but that doesn't mean it came as a surprise. Many experts expected it to happen because of the fault lines that it sits on. But Kathmandu, unlike Los Angeles, is filled with buildings which are not made to stand up to an earthquake. So this kind of devastation was expected at some time. They knew it would eventually happen. Yanis Rogers, a structural engineer who helps developing countries earthquake-proof their infrastructure, says seeing modern vulnerable construction go up without engineering input, building codes, or thought for earthquake design made a lot of people very worried. And he was speaking of the expert in his field. He continues by saying that Kathmandu isn't unique, and that similar devastation could happen anytime in Mexico City or Istanbul, two incredibly poor cities built on or near fault lines with substandard buildings. The point he makes is that this is essentially a question of economics. The technology is available to earthquake-proof buildings, and if there was sufficient foreign investment to developing countries like Nepal, such catastrophes could be avoided. Now, I don't wish to be political, and at least not party political, but our own government has reduced its foreign aid from 0.5% of gross national income to 0.3% by 2027. That's a reduction of approximately £5 billion to the poorest countries. And this is a drop in the ocean compared with Trump's America that has cut its foreign aid by 56%, a drop of $29 billion. Now, please don't get me wrong. I am aware that governments have huge economic challenges. I get that. But we need to always be aware of the plight of the poor. It reminds me of Paul writing to the Galatians, telling them about the pillars of the Jerusalem church, Peter, James and John, who commissioned Paul and Barnabas to take the gospel to the Gentiles and instructed them to remember the poor, to which Paul adds, the very thing I was eager to do. I'm not wishing to take sides in party to politics, as none of the political parties are exemplary in this area, but I do speak as a follower of Christ, the one who instructed us to love God and love our neighbour. And my neighbour is not just the man next door, but my neighbour is everyone who has breath in his lungs or her lungs. There are no barriers in the kingdom of God. Jesus said, what good is it if you only love those who love you? What reward will you get? I remember when starting off Tamworth Food Bank some 14 years ago, I was trying to encourage support from around the town, and one evening I received a phone call from one organisation that said they wished to support us, but only as long as we provided food only to Tamworth people, none of these foreigners. I responded, what, like Welsh people? My sarcasm was lost on him. I thanked him for his call and told him that his terms were not acceptable to us. What I really wanted to say was, no, let's not go there. Did you know that 21,000 children die each day from malnutrition and contaminated drinking water, which is about the total number of children in Tamworth every day? Thousands of people around the world die through hunger, yet the world has more than enough food for everyone on the planet. All too often, corrupt rulers spend millions on lavish premises and military equipment while their people starve. The world produces 1.5 times enough food to feed everyone on the planet. And yet 16% of the world's population, that's approximately 1 in 6 people, is consuming some 80% of its natural resources, or put it the other way around, which is even more poignant. 84% of the world lives on just 20%, 1/5 of its natural resources. To me, at least, it seems unreasonable to blame God for our unwillingness as human beings to act responsibly in giving aid and through supporting the poorest people on the planet. My first point is that some of human suffering is caused through natural disasters like earthquakes and famines and the like, and it has a human element to it. Now let's ask the question of, why are there earthquakes and natural disasters at all in a world created by a God who is good and omnipotent? If the first part of this talk is focused on economics, the next part will be more theological. From the start, we need to say that God is not the creator of evil and suffering. In Genesis 1:31, we are told that God saw all that he had made and it was very good. And as we saw earlier, God gave humans free will to love him or not to love him. And we chose not, rejected his love and turned away from him. And when we humans told God to shove off, he partially honoured our request. Nature began to revolt, genetic breakdown, disease began, pain and death became a part of human experience. Our world is in a state of decay. Let's try to understand this by way of a simple illustration. On the 26th of April, 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine exploded and released large quantities of radioactive particles into the atmosphere, which spread over much of Western Soviet Union as it was then, and Europe. The Chernobyl disaster is considered to have been the worst nuclear power plant accident in history. And apart from the deaths that it also caused many long-term effects such as cancers, particularly thyroid cancer, and deformities in children born in proximity to the nuclear plant or to parents who were infected by that radiation. The nuclear fallout affected the lakes and reservoirs, flora and fauna, the food chain. And even today, 39 years on, that explosion still makes its deadly impact on surrounding areas. The Bible tells us that there was a kind of spiritual explosion that makes Chernobyl pale into insignificance when human beings rebelled against God. There was a devastating fallout in the whole universe, and the once perfect world became imperfect, and humans became infected by sickness and disease and death. The whole cosmos was affected by what we call natural disasters, which are symptoms of the malfunction of the creation with its creator. And just like Chernobyl, the fallout continues and carries on, causing misery and destruction in the world today. This account is found in the first book of the Bible, Genesis. Many people trip themselves up when attempting to read Genesis. They read all this stuff about fruit trees and fig leaves and talking snakes and missing ribs and playing hide and seek in the garden far too literally, I believe. And in doing so, they miss the wood for the trees. Excuse the pun. These early chapters in Genesis are a part of an ancient narrative, an amazing metaphor of some astonishing truths that God wants us to know. But if we try to read Genesis as some kind of pseudo-scientific statement, we can miss what it is truly about. Genesis has some very important messages for us, such as God created the world in which we live. God created human beings in his own likeness. God created human beings as the pinnacle of his creation, and we were given responsibility for the planet. Those human beings rebelled against God and were responsible for the downward spiral. A spiritual Chernobyl happened. The world that God created was very good, but since humanity's rebellion against God, both humans and creation itself have been subject to decay and death. Paul writes in his magnificent chapter 8 of Romans, in verse 22, "For we know that all creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to this present time." I think that that's a great description, really, of our planet. It's a groaning planet. But it isn't always going to be like that. In fact, in the previous verse, in verse 21, Paul writes that creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. There is coming a day when this groaning planet will be liberated from its bondage to decay. A pregnant mother to be groans in childbirth, but when the baby is born, her groaning it turns to joy. And Paul says that the planet is just like that mother. It's been groaning for some time now, but there is coming a day when the groaning will turn to joy, a time when God will eradicate suffering and earthquakes and tsunamis and famine and renew this groaning planet. There's coming a day when all those things will be restored to their former glory. The earth will be redeemed. There will be new heavens and a new earth. This all means that any suffering in this life is only temporary. In fact, our suffering will pale into insignificance in comparison to what God has in store for his followers. It helps if we take a long-term perspective. The Apostle Paul, who suffered through beatings and stonings and shipwrecks and imprisonments and rejection and hunger and thirst and homelessness, and experienced far more pain than most of us will ever need to endure, refers to these troubles as our light and momentary troubles. Just catch that, light and momentary. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, he tells of his hardships. 5 different times his back was shredded when he was flogged with 39 lashes of the whip. 3 times he was beaten to a pulp by rods. Once he was stoned. 3 times he was shipwrecked. Once he spent a whole day and night adrift in the sea. He faced dangers from rivers and robbers. He was hungry and thirsty. He shivered with cold, not having enough clothes to keep him warm, and many other hardships. But he says, for our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. He wrote in Romans chapter 8, verse 18, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. Some might say, if God has the power to eradicate evil and suffering, why doesn't he do it? But just because he hasn't done it yet, it doesn't mean that he won't do it. Criticizing God for not sorting out this groaning planet is like reading half a novel and criticizing the author for not tying up the loose ends of the plot. There is coming a day when God himself will redress the balances of the world. That is what the Bible teaches. And without this balancing of the books, suffering, quite frankly, wouldn't make any sense at all. I love what the New Testament scholar, former Anglican Bishop Tom Wright, says in his book, Surprised by Hope. God's coming judgment is a good thing, something to be celebrated, longed for, yearned over. It causes people to shout for joy, and indeed the trees of the field to clap their hands. In a world of systematic injustice and bullying and violence, arrogance and oppression, the thought that there may be coming a day when the wicked are firmly put in their place and the poor and the weak are given their dues is the best news there can be. Faced with a world of rebellion, a world full of exploitation and wickedness, a good God must be a God of judgment. If there was no promise of that day when God sorts it all out, every injustice, then suffering and death wouldn't really make any sense at all. Let's say that on the first day of 2025, you had a terrible day. You had a painful root canal at the dentist, you crashed your car, family member contracted some awful illness, you heard that you had failed your exams, a friend betrays you. From start to finish, it is a very, very, very bad day indeed. But every other day of the year was just plain terrific. You win £5 million on the European lottery. And after giving your gift to the church, 50%, you get to keep 2.5 million. You get promoted at work to your dream job. If you are single, you find the person of your dreams who falls madly in love with you. You get married and your marriage is idyllic and your health is fabulous, and you have a 3-month holiday in the Seychelles. And if you're a Villa supporter, You see your club win the Premiership and the European Champions Cup and the FA Cup. But more than that, even better, you see the Blues relegated again. Obviously, the opposite is true if you're a Blues fan. But you get my drift. This is a good year. Then next New Year's Day, 2026, somebody asks, so how was your 2025? And you'd say it was great. It was wonderful. And they'd say, but didn't it start off badly? Didn't you go through a lot of trouble on that first day? You'd think for a moment and say, oh yeah, you're right. I'd forgotten about that. That was a bad day, no denying it. That was a difficult time. But when I look at the totality of the year, when I put everything in context, it was a great year. The 364 terrific days far outweigh the one bad day. It sort of just fades away in my memory. And the same will be true in heaven. That's not to deny the reality of our pain in this life. It might be terrible. It might be chronic. It might go on for all of our lives, 70 or 80 years. But in heaven, after 54,484,545 days of pure bliss, and with infinitely more to come, if someone asked you, so how has your existence been? You'd instantly react by saying, it has been absolutely wonderful. Words can't describe the joy and the delight and the fulfillment. Former Bishop of Maidstone, Gavin Reid, tells a story about meeting a young man who had fallen downstairs at the age of 1 and had shattered his back. He'd been in and out of hospitals his whole life, and yet made an astounding comment that he thought his God was fair. Bishop Reid asked him, how old are you? The boy said 17. How many years have you spent in hospitals? He asked. The boy said 13 years. Gavin Reid responded, and you think that God is fair? The boy replied, but God has got all of eternity to make it up to me, and he will. For as Paul writes, no eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind has conceived what God has prepared for those who love him. Maybe the best theological voice on this subject comes from Sonny in the best exotic Marigold Hotel, where he says everything will be all right in the end. And if it's not all right, then it's not the end. I'll finish there. This morning we might have gained another couple of pieces of our jigsaw, helping us to see just a little bit more clearly. But I am so very aware that we still have big gaps in our overall picture. In thinking of some of the great injustices of our world, I'm reminded of a cartoon I saw of two turtles. The first turtle says, sometimes I'd like to ask why God allows poverty, famine and injustice when he could do something about it. And the other turtle says, I'm afraid that God might ask me the same question. Food for thought. God bless. Have a great week.